My grandmother used to say, "Show me who your friends are, and I will show you who you are." We have all types of relationships in our life. These relationships start as children with our parents. And as adults, we have work partners, colleagues, and friends. I agree with my grandmother's wisdom that relationships show us who we are. As a physician, I can't help but wonder, do relationships impact health? Today, we will begin to explore that very question. We will look at relationships with our parents, spouse and partner, and even larger social networks. Let's start at the beginning and look at our first relationship, the relationship with our parents. And can that relationship impact our health? An incredible study was conducted called the Harvard Mastery of Stress Study. 126 male Harvard students were studied for 35 years. The point of the study was to look at whether or not parental relationships had any effect at all on disease 35 years later in midlife. They asked these participants 4 questions. Describe your relationship with your mom and with your dad, and was it very close? Was it warm and friendly? Was it tolerant? Or was it strained and cold? Well, I find what they found totally amazing. If you identified your relationship with your parents as strained, there was a 100% incidence of significant health risk 35 years later. This included things like coronary disease, cancer, hypertension, ulcers, even alcohol abuse. Now, what if your relationship was warm and close? You cut this risk from 100% to 47%. That's an amazing difference. I think even the researchers were amazed at what they found. And they tried to explain these results. And this is what they concluded. And actually, their conclusions make a lot of sense to me. They said, what do we learn from our parents? Basically, we learn everything. We learn how to eat from our parents. We learn our exercise habits from our parents. Our coping styles frequently come from our parents. If you show me someone who's angry and tries to resolve conflict by anger, there's a good chance that that person learned that style from their parents. And on a deeper level, our parents give us our spiritual values and our spiritual practices. They teach us what's important in life. A second study was conducted at Johns Hopkins and followed in this case for 50 years. The Johns Hopkins study took over 1,000 medical students, and they looked at closeness to parents. And what they concluded 50 years later was that cancer rates correlated closely with the degree of closeness to a parent. Now, I have to tell you about one of my colleagues. I have a friend and fellow physician named Vince Folletti, who's living in San Diego and has conducted years of research on what's called adverse childhood events. And what made him do this was he started to notice that when people had addictions later in life, they seemed to come from troubled childhood families. So this sent him on a quest where he studied over 18,000 people. And his study is called the ACE study, or Adverse Childhood Events Study. And what the research shows is the more trauma a child faces, such as fighting in the home, hitting among parents, parents being in jail, sexual abuse, the higher the risk of major illness in midlife, but also a much higher risk of drug and alcohol abuse. So what do? Are we stuck if we had less than optimal relationships with our parents? No, of course not. We're not stuck. We all need to embrace our past. We don't want to become victims of our past. And as you will see later on, forgiveness and acceptance are the key. So how we grow up can affect illness 35 and 50 years later. What else can affect our health? Well, let's take a look at relationships with our spouse and partner. What impact do these have? An interesting study was reported in the American Journal of Medicine. This was a great question. 10,000 men who were already identified with 3 or more cardiac risk factors asked, "Does your wife show you love?" What a great question. It's their perception of love. And then these guys were followed for 5 years. And what they found was this. Those who answered yes, their wife showed them love, had a 50% lower rate of chest discomfort, angina, actually the manifestation of coronary artery disease, a 50% lower rate of angina onset than those who answered no. So I know a lot of you are turning to your wife right now and saying, "Show me love." And it is an important question. Another interesting question reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1992 asked, "Are you married? Or do you have a confidant?" And this question was asked to 1,400 men and women. So these men and women had a cardiac catheterization, so their actual coronary anatomy was known. The variables were, are you married? Or do you have someone you can confide in? This is what they found. People who were not married and had no close confidant had 3 times the death rate of the other groups over 5 years. Are you connected? That's what this study is saying. Do you have someone that you can talk to, that you can confide in, a confidant? That could be your spouse, or maybe it's not your spouse. Someone that you can tell some of your deepest, darkest concerns to. That's what this study tells me, because if we have that kind of connection, there's a pretty good chance we have a lot less stress. Let's take a look at another marriage study. This study was conducted in Britain, and it looked at the relationship between unhealthy marriages or unhappy marriages, and heart disease. They studied over 9,000 British civil servants. In this study, they had 6,000 men and about 2,800 women. They were also followed a long time, for 12 years. And this is what they concluded. Unhappy marriages led to 34% more coronary events, regardless of things like gender and social status, just being in an unhappy marriage. Now, I don't have to tell you, it makes total sense. We talked already about stress, the stress hormones, and the impact of stress on our heart. Now, of course, there are many facts that contribute to a good relationship versus a poor relationship. There are many variables. Let's take a look at one of them. Does being optimistic in a relationship make a difference? One group of couples was studied over a 2-year period. And the researchers found that optimism is clearly linked to happier and more satisfying romantic relationships. They concluded that this was due to greater cooperative problem solving. Another study reported in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2006 demonstrated that optimistic couples resolve conflict faster, see the other as supportive, and live up to the other's ideals and expectations. So to me, this gets back to what we previously discussed. The optimists are positive. I think it's about the power of being positive. Their glass is half full. They see the good in their partner. They're not focusing on those little things that sometimes can become annoying. It's all a matter of where we put our focus. Do we see the big picture, or do we just see the toothpaste in the bathroom sink? Could that explain why optimists live longer? Because they do. 999 men and women were followed over 9 years. And they were divided into 4 groups, and the groups assessed their level of optimism. Optimists had a 55% lower risk of death from all causes and a 23% lower risk of cardiovascular death. So clearly, optimism is good for our relationships, but it's also good for our health. So up to this point, we have been focusing on intimate relationships, our relationship with our parents and our relationship with our partners. Now let's broaden the conversation a little bit. Let's take a look at the impact of our social networks on our health. A wonderful spiritual teacher named Satyananda had this to say: "The I in illness is isolation. The W-E in wellness is we." Well, is there research out there to support Satyananda's claim? Let's go to Roseto, Pennsylvania. I want to talk for a few minutes on this amazing study, the Roseto study. Italians moved from a little town in Italy to Pennsylvania, and they kept immigrating over the course of time. The town of Roseto attracted the epidemiologists. They said, why is it that in this one little town, people are not having heart attacks? They're smoking, they have diabetes, they have cholesterol. So the epidemiologists decided they were going to go into Roseto and take a look at things like soil, air, water. They really wanted to understand why they weren't having heart attacks at the same rate as all of the surrounding communities. What was so special about Roseto? Well, as they started to look at the community, they realized it had nothing to do with the water, the air, the food. It couldn't be explained by any of those things. And they also knew, years later, that those family members that picked up and moved from Roseto developed heart disease at the same rate as whatever community they were in. So they concluded this. They called it the Roseto effect, and they said it was about the household and the community. There were 3-generation households in Roseto. Grandma was in the house with parents and children. This was very common. There was a high degree of religiosity, traditional values. Families ate together. They attributed the protection from heart disease to the social network. After the 1970s, children began to move away. There was a breakdown of these multi-generational households. With the increased mobility, the heart attack prevalence was the same as the surrounding communities. The authors concluded the golden age of Roseto was over. Now, I grew up in one of those families. My grandmother was in the house cooking all day. Aunts were around. Parents were around. It was a big community. It was a tribe, if you might. This is common, extended families in Italian households. And it has a profound effect on health. Why do I think so? Because there's less stress. A researcher named Nancy Fraser Smith also did an interesting study looking at social support. And she studied depression. She took 880 people who had already had a heart attack. Now, we know that depression is an independent risk factor for heart disease. Depressed people don't say, oh, I'm going to eat Dr. Guarneri's Brussels sprouts and broccoli and go and exercise. There's a good chance if you're depressed, you might say, I'm not exercising today, and this donut is making me feel really good. So depression is a big concern for me in my practice. Well, she looked at Beck depression scales, and she looked at how depressed people were, but she did something else. She looked at whether or not they felt socially supported, whether they had community, family around them. And this is what she found. She found that even in people who were severely depressed, the effect of the depression on their heart, on their cardiac death rates, was negated if they felt a good sense of social support. Now, to me, that's powerful, powerful medicine. And one more study. This is the Alameda County study. 17 years, 7,000 men and women. Those who lack social contact, what I say, being home alone, people who don't have friends, relatives, churches, social groups, anything, had a 3.1-fold higher death rate. And in this study, they controlled for everything else: age, sex, smoking, eating, alcohol, all those other things that you may be thinking about. What they concluded was that it was about social connection. And one of my favorite studies appeared in JAMA in 1997. 276 healthy people were asked to have the rhinovirus placed in their nose. I don't know about you, but I don't know that I would have volunteered for this study. What they were looking at was really resiliency. We talked about the soil and being resilient. So they looked at social connections, 12 different types of relationships, things we've been talking about: parents, childhood, groups, connection. Everyone had the virus inserted in their nose, and no surprise, those with the least number of social connections were 4 times more likely to get the cold virus infection. So if relationships are so important, can creating social connection be a treatment? I remember when we did the Ornish research in the 1990s, we had something called the cohort effect. Now, cohort means band of warriors, and we would bring in groups of really sick patients, 10 or 15 or 20 at a time. These people had bad coronary disease, they were depressed, they were diabetic, they were overweight. They had all of these medical problems. And what we noticed almost immediately was that when they came into the cardiac rehab groups together, they came to life. They now had 20 new friends, people they can exercise with. They would start calling each other at home. They became socially connected. They prepared meals together. We conducted this research in the 90s. I still have patients from that original study. Now, this is 15 years later, that are getting together to have meals, to walk, and just to talk about life. So to me, it was so much more important than what their cholesterol level was. Yeah, I was concerned about cholesterol, and you know I was concerned about blood pressure, but it was this entity, if you might, that we called the cohort effect, just being together, remembering the W-E in wellness. There's one other study that I really liked a lot, and it's a study that looked at an important spiritual principle. And that principle is it's better to give than receive. This was a study of over 700 older adults. And if you look in almost any culture, you will usually find the grandparent paired with the youngest. This is normal. So what this study looked at was, what if we took older adults and paired them with younger children, whether it's to read, to color, to do some sort of interaction. This is what they found. Those who gave love and support to others had significantly fewer health issues. So, if it is so important to have a social network, can we use this concept of social network, like I did in my heart program, to actually be a treatment for disease? Can it impact the course of a chronic disease? I think the answer is yes. And let's take a look at some research. David Spiegel has done some very interesting research in women with breast cancer. He conducted a study in which he created a support group to help women adjust to their diagnosis of breast cancer. What he was looking for was, could he decrease their depression, their anxiety, and their stress. So women with breast cancer were asked to participate in a 90-minute group session once a week for 1 year. Well, he got his outcome. Women in the support group showed less depression, less anger, less anxiety. But this is what shocked everyone. The women in the support groups lived twice as long, 18 months compared to 9 months in the control group. And an additional study was done that was very similar, looking at melanoma. Patients with a very malignant form of skin cancer, melanoma, were randomized to 6 weeks of group support versus a control. They were studied for 5 years. That's a long time. And they found 13 recurrences of melanoma in the control group versus 7 in the group that went to group support. That's almost half the amount. Take a look at the deaths. 10 deaths in the control group versus only 3 with group support. So, as I've seen with my patients, one of the key ingredients to health is connection. Social connection, connection to family, connection to friends, and as you'll see in a later lecture, connection to spiritual community. I still have the cohort effect going on at my cardiac rehab program. One of my greatest joys is when someone comes to see me in my office and it's very clear that they're home alone and isolated and they're living with the fear of coronary artery disease. And when I convince them to come into our lifestyle change program, which means they get to come and be at our center 3 times a week, invariably, these people tell me, this has changed my life. And it's not about their blood pressure or cholesterol. It's about their new connections, their social network, and their friends. So we have talked about the health impact of relationships through every stage of life. We concluded that healthy relationships, social connection, and optimism are essential ingredients to good health. As we have said in previous lectures, through what lens do you see? And as we discussed earlier, Satyananda said, the W-E in wellness is indeed we. Welcome back. Florence Nightingale had this to say: the needs of the spirit are as crucial to health as those individual organs which make up the body. Do we have science to back up Florence Nightingale's claim? In this lecture, we will explore what research has revealed about the relationship between spirituality and health. There are many definitions for spirituality. One is, spirituality is a sense of connection with the source of ultimate meaning. Frequently, spirituality includes connection with oneself, with others, with nature, or a higher power. This connection helps an individual make sense of their life. Why is there so much interest in spirituality? For many people, it is truly a quest for meaning and for wholeness. Whether we want to admit it or not, science cannot answer all the questions. The human heart has a hidden want which science cannot supply. This quote from Sir William Osler sums it up: a hidden want or a hidden desire for which we may not have an answer. Benjamin Rush found that hidden want in religion. He said, "A religion of some kind is as essential to the mind as air is to respiration." We can think of religion as a way of life, and it includes community and connection to others. Religion includes a philosophy, and it's frequently associated with service. Religion also has traditions, practices, and rituals. In my practice, I always ask people about their spiritual practices, whether they consider themselves religious or spiritual. And many people today tell me they consider themselves spiritual. So spirituality may or may not involve formal religion, but it is almost always included in religious practices. Why is this even important in medicine? And why would a cardiologist even be talking about it? Well, the Mayo Clinic in 2001 reported the following statistics. 90% of people believe in a higher being. 94% of people regard their spiritual and physical health as equally important. And even 96% of family practice physicians believe that spiritual well-being is a factor in health. With numbers like these, it's not surprising that more and more research is showing a strong connection between spirituality and health. Let's take a look at some of that research. A meta-analysis was published in the year 2000 in the Journal of Health Psychology. This meta-analysis reviewed 42 studies, nearly 126,000 people. And what they found was that highly religious people had a 29% higher odds of survival compared with less religious people. The authors were unable to attribute this finding to any confounding variables or even to publication bias. A second study to look at religion and mortality was published in the American Journal of Public Health. 5,286 adults were followed for 28 years. Those who attended religious services at least once per week had a 23% reduction in their mortality. This study also adjusted for things like age, sex, ethnicity, education, and so on. Even physical parameters like body mass index, health practices. And still, there was a 23% reduction in mortality in those who attended religious services. Further data from the Mayo Clinic may have the answer to why spiritually active people live longer. Their data shows that religious attenders have lower blood pressure, are more likely to comply with their medications, are definitely more likely to exercise more, eat healthier foods, and even have healthier habits. They are more likely to give up cigarettes and alcohol. In addition, they are more likely to use preventative health services. They also found that religious individuals are more accepting of death. They have less depression and anxiety, and they are less likely to abuse drugs. The research even showed they were less likely to commit suicide. Now, I'm fascinated by this. And whenever I think about religion and health and spirituality and health, I have to think about my patients, Lillian and George. Let me describe Lillian and George to you. Lillian is 95 and George is 97. They have been together for over 60 some odd years. They're tall, they're thin, they can bend down and pick things up quickly. They have no physical limitations that I can see. They have been vegan their entire life. They are very careful to tell me, Dr. G, we walk 2.5 miles a day, exactly 2.5 miles a day. George is a minister. He teaches Bible study. Lillian goes with George every week to the Bible study class. She's been doing this for over 60 years. So they are very connected. They're connected to their spiritual community. They're connected to each other. So I asked my cardiac residents, what is it that's helping George and Lillian to be doing so well at 95 and 97? Well, George and Lillian are members of the Seventh-day Adventist community. And as part of their religion, health is considered a key component. Lillian once said to me, health is being closer to God. But research is showing similar health benefits across a wide range of religious traditions. Let's take a look at one. A 23-year prospective study was conducted in 10,059 male Israeli civil servants. What they found was that Orthodox Jewish men had a 20% decreased risk of a fatal heart attack or heart disease when compared with non-religious men. They looked at everything. They adjusted for age and blood pressure and cholesterol and smoking and diabetes, how big they were, mass index, all the baseline risks. And still, at the end of the day, over 10,000 people studied, a 20% decrease in fatal cardiac events in those people that were Orthodox and had strong religious values. Another study, also conducted in Israel, demonstrated that secular Jews had a higher chance of having a first heart attack when compared with Orthodox Jews. As in the first study, everything was controlled for: age, ethnicity, education, smoking, physical exercise. The authors had to conclude at the end of the day that there was something about the connection to religion and spirituality that led to health. I bet some of you had a similar experience to what I've had in my life, where you're working longer and harder and harder and longer, and work stops becoming a joy. I love my patients. I can certainly live without the administration. But for me as a physician, I know that the day I began to see my work as service, I no longer felt like it was work. When my spiritual life started to open, I changed my whole perspective on what I do every day. The research shows that physicians with a spiritual life are 25% happier. I know that this is true for me. So at the end of the day, what do we attribute this to? What do we really think it's about? Why do we see these health advantages in people who are religious, people who are spiritual? What advantage do they have? I'll tell you what I think it comes down to. It comes down to a very strong social support network. I know when my patients have surgery, if they are part of a spiritual community or a religious group, it really doesn't matter. They have a whole team mobilizing around them, not only to take care of them, but to support their spouse, their children, whatever they need. I remember one of my patients saying, when my husband had his bypass, I didn't have to cook for a month because my community, what she called her tribe, brought new food every single day. So I think that's important. People who are spiritual also tend to have increased hope, more contentment, more peace in their life. And they also tend to be more optimistic. So think about this combination. Stronger social support, more love, more hope, more contentment, more optimism. You know the effect this is going to have on the stress hormones. They're going to be negated. I think that's why people who are spiritual and religious have less medical problems. I think, quite frankly, they turn their problems over to a higher power. And when you can do that, you take the burden off of you. There's a Cheyenne proverb that says, when you lose the rhythm of the drumbeat of God, you are lost from the peace and rhythm of life. That's truly important, the peace and rhythm of life. Now, you may not think, as a cardiologist, I see this in my practice, but I see it every day. Only it comes in under different names. It comes into my practice as depression. It comes in as hopelessness. I see it as isolation. My patients frequently describe it as stress, or they'll say to me, I'm suffering. And I also see it when people lack meaning and purpose. Let me tell you a story about some of my colleagues. I take care of a lot of physicians. And one of the scariest things for me is to tell a surgeon, it's not wise for you to go back and do surgery. Basically, what I'm saying is, your career is over as you know it. This is devastating, especially in men. It's not unusual for all of us to identify who we are with what we do. And if we take away that, what we do, we lose the meaning and purpose in our life. If we have no meaning and purpose, why do we get out of bed in the morning? This is crucially important. So I see people come in and tell me, I'm blue, I'm down. Why bother? This is how it presents. Depression, for example, has a 40% higher coronary artery disease rate and a 60% higher death rate. And depression has a kissing cousin, if you might, something called hopelessness. We frequently see depression and hopelessness together. But if someone comes into the hospital and they're depressed, they don't do very well. Especially people who already have documented coronary artery disease. They are less likely to do well with surgery. They have more post-surgical complications. They have a twofold increased risk in their outpatient mortality and a fivefold increase in death after a first heart attack. So I always tell my cardiac fellows, when you talk to our patients and they've had a heart attack, do you look at the situation of their life? Do you find out what's been going on? Everyone is so happy to report the cholesterol level, but they forget to report if someone is depressed, if they're stressed, if they're socially isolated, if they feel hopeless, if they've given up. These are equally important and independent risk factors for disease. Now remember, we talked about this concept of the autonomic nervous system. We said that autonomic means automatic. Let's take a quick review. If our foot is on the gas all the time, that means our sympathetic nervous system is revved up. We're stimulated. This is what occurs when we live under chronic stress. We have our foot on the gas. On the other side, we can have our foot on the brake. That's our relaxation side to the nervous system, what we call the parasympathetic nervous system. What we really want is to have these two in balance. You can't be on the gas all the time. You can't be on the brake all the time. So they need to be in balance. And we discussed something called heart rate variability. And heart rate variability, that beat-to-beat variation between heartbeats, is an important predictor of health. As a reminder, if the heart rate variability is low, that's an independent predictor of heart attack and sudden cardiac death. If heart rate variability is high, that implies more flexibility within the autonomic nervous system and is associated with a better outcome. And we talked about how can we modify this intentionally. We said we can modify it through our breathing, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. We talked about modifying heart rate variability with Tai Chi. We talked about modifying it with prayer and with mantra repetition. Why is it connected to depression and hopelessness when we lose touch with who we are? The researchers believe that this is related to low heart rate variability. It is felt that when people feel hopeless and they give up, they are less likely to comply with those things that will improve their heart rate variability and make them healthy. You've heard me say this before. If someone is feeling hopeless, my telling them go out and exercise and eat green leafy vegetables is probably not going to work. I need a different approach. I can't start there. I see a lot of people who come to me after open heart surgery. Like Ron, who I talked about. They say, I want to get off this train track. One surgery is enough for me. But there's something else that I see, and this is not rare. People come to see me after surgery, and the best way I can describe it is they are a shell of themselves. So what happens when someone goes through the trauma of a big surgery? It's terrifying. When I try talking to these patients, they just stare at me. And frequently the wife is next to the husband who's had the surgery, and the wife is taking notes, and the wife is telling me what medications they're on. Why? Because the person who had the surgery is just not there. You know, in medicine, we have a little kind of a nasty way of describing this. We say the lights are on, but nobody's home. But to me, this is trauma. This is emotional trauma. This is shock. This is how we feel when we get bad news. 1 minute on my patient, George. George was a big, strong, concrete worker, construction guy, had to have a bypass. Came back to me after his bypass, and he wasn't the same person. We were trying everything that Western medicine can give him, but he was just disconnected completely. And then one day, after George had a healing touch treatment, I went and I whispered in his ear. And I said, George, I need you to call your spirit back. The Native Americans say, call your spirit back. I said, call it back from the operating room. Call it back from the surgeon's office. I need you to do this. I need you to want to live. And guess what happened? George came back, and he said to me, Dr. Guarneri, of all the things you could have told me, when you told me to call my spirit back, I connected. I got what you were saying. So how do we call our spirit back? How do I help my patients to call their spirit back? And how do you call your spirit back? Well, it's about reconnecting with what's important in this life. It's about finding hope, establishing community, and even if we have a health challenge, change our perspective on that challenge. And ultimately, we have to work toward finding inner peace. As a holistic, integrative medicine physician, I take this idea very seriously. Remember, holistic means whole, to treat the whole person, body, mind, emotions, and spirit. And just as I ask my patients, what did you do for body, mind, emotions, and spirit today? I address all of those issues in my practice. Now, we have seen a few of the tools that make integrative holistic medicine special. I couldn't just give my patient George a pill. I promise you, he was on every pill that was available, including antidepressants. But what makes the integrative holistic medicine approach is I have the opportunity to pick from a bigger toolbox. You have already heard about many of these tools. The first being guided imagery. Today, George would have had guided imagery tapes before he went for his bypass surgery. And he would have listened to those tapes before and after surgery. And as we showed, his chances of being in the hospital 2 days less were pretty high. We talked about other ways to connect body, mind, and spirit. We talked about the power of meditation. And we talked about yoga. Some of the easiest techniques we have available with us all the time. Breathing techniques like the heart-centered breath, which we already know stops the stress response right in its tracks. Repetitive prayer and mantras. All of these techniques work to help us find inner peace. I mentioned to you that George was receiving healing touch when I whispered into his ear, "Call your spirit back." Why did I send him for healing touch? Because I think the healing touch is the glue that helps to keep my patients together. That's how profound a treatment it is. And in George's case, the combination worked like magic. And you know what? Patients want me to spend time talking about spiritual issues. Do you know an average patient appointment is 20 minutes? Yet, 10% of patients are willing to give up time spent on their medical issues in an office visit to discuss religion and spiritual practices. Patients want to get back on track. They know it's important. There are some other equally important aspects of spirituality that we will address. These are big ones. Forgiveness. Practicing gratitude. How do I help someone get from that glass that's half empty to a glass that's half full? Well, we'll be talking about this and one of the key steps to getting there. The power of positive thinking. Because when we put it all together, whether it's yoga and meditation, whether it's mantras and prayer, whether it's forgiveness and gratitude, we're not just healing the physical body. What we are doing is integrating everything. That's why we call it integrative medicine. We're integrating body, mind, emotions, and spirit. And even more importantly, we are saying the physical, mental, and emotional aspects of healing cannot be separated.